So I'm going to begin with a piece of music from the mid-1600s from northern Italy. And I wouldn't normally tell people how to listen, but I'd just like you to think of one thing while I'm playing it, which is to observe where the stresses in the music happens. This piece is in 3 beats in the bar. So basically there's a stress about there. We're just going to begin there. Just have that in your mind, and then we'll go from there. So this was written in Bologna by Giuseppe Torelli. So the reason I find this a useful place to begin is that what all writing and music share is we use repetitive elements, but we move across them in different ways. And I want to put that right next to a late 19th century poem, a very famous poem by the English writer Christina Rossetti. Some of you will know this, some of you won't. Let me read it to you, again asking you to listen for the same things, which is I'm going to exaggerate the stresses a bit and just observe what happens, and I'm going to talk about some elements of this as we go. My heart is like a singing bird whose nest is in a watered shoot. My heart is like an apple tree whose boughs are bent with 6 set fruit. My heart is like a rainbow shell that paddles in a purple sea. My heart is gladder than all these because my love is come to me. Raise me a dais of purple and gold. Hang it with fire and purple dyes. Carve it in doves and pomegranates and peacocks with 100 eyes. Work it in gold and silver grapes, in leaves and silver fleur-de-lis. Because the birthday of my life is come, my love is come to me. Now that's a deliberately very, very simple bit of tetrameter. So it means it's got, a lot of you will know this, but poetry, like music, is divided up into feet. Music we divide up into bars. So the equivalent of the poetic foot would be me playing. Now, when you speak and when you make a sentence, the techniques you use to make each other understand each other are basically iambic. They are feet. We stress bits of the sentence, and we use all kinds of things. We use rhythm, and we use the way we find our way through a line to do that. And the way all of us speak, whatever language we come from, is derived from these poetic tricks. What you just heard, the most important thing I want to point out to you is the game which Rossetti has played between the 2 halves. In the first half, there's a descriptive thing where the strong beat, the first foot, begins after an upbeat. So if you describe something, my heart is like a singing bird. The stress is on heart all the way through, whose nest is in a watered shoot. My heart is an apple tree. But if you move to the second, so that means each foot is my heart is like a singing bird. It's tetrameter, which means there are four feet per line, basically. Most of you will know in Shakespeare it uses pentameter, 5 per line. I won't yet talk about what is in the feet. Go to the second verse, where it does what we all recognize when we give an order. If you tell someone to do something, you say, come here. You put the stress right on the front, effectively when you speak, on the front of that foot. Come here. It might be a trochee. You might say, come here, or come here would be a spondy. Don't worry about any of that. Just observe the difference. My heart is like a singing bird. That would be like me going an upbeat to a downbeat. So just kind of watch that going past, if you like. The second verse, raise me a dais of purple and gold. So that's putting, that will be like beginning a bit of music, giving an order. And if you work through the second verse, you'll see gradually it moves away and it finds its way back to the organization of the feet from the first verse. So we have raise me a dais, hang it with via, carve it with doves, hang on, and peacocks. So line 4 moves back to the old form. So then by the end, we have work it in gold by silver grapes. It moves from a stress on the beginning of the line to a mixed one and the other. That's the first thing to observe, is that there's a very simple structure there. It's in two halves. One half uses one particular kind of stress. The other half is dominated by the second kind of stress, finds its way back to the earliest kind. Now think about writing. One of the things I want to play with is the fact that, I don't sing. I use no words in music. But why is it that music communicates so well? One of the reasons are these techniques. I think we all know that language communicates this way. More than 90% of language is not meaning, it's how we organize things and how we organize the emphasis, you might call it the rhetoric. One of the most important things is structure. I mean, I know that Melinda will talk to you about structure the whole time. That's a very, very simple way of looking at it. So let's just go to something which might seem a little bit more abstruse. I want to suggest an idea to you all, which is if you think about what we might see as rather more complicated, less apparent poetic forms, these very simple forms underline it the whole time. Here's my first reason for us making sure we keep an eye to poetry always. Is this. So if I take a line from a verse from one of the most famous poems by T.S. Eliot, probably the most famous poem by T.S. Eliot, the love song Alvalfryd J. Prufrock. The best verse in it for me is one that talks about a cat. It's actually a cat, or is it a cat, or is it fog? This is heptameters. This is dividing the line into 7, turning it into hexameters, dividing the line into 6. But don't worry about that. It's complicated, obviously. The yellow fog that rubs its back upon the window panes, the yellow smoke that runs its muzzle on the window panes, licked its tongue into the corners of the evening, lingered upon the pools that stand in drains. Let it fall upon its back, the soot that falls from chimneys, slipped by the terrace, made a sudden leap, and, seeing that it was a soft October night, curled once about the house and fell asleep. So there's some things you recognize from what you just heard then, the way that the stresses work, for instance. I'm not going to talk about the imagery, but I want to give you another bit of Eliot from a less well-known poem, but a more important poem. This is Eliot doing very, very basic poetry, what in English we call doggerel. Basically, it's so this is from a poem which is a little later than Prufrock, the 4 quartets, the first of the 4 quartets, has this following line. I want you to think about one thing. The way that the rhythm is organized is opposite to the subject matter. The wounded surgeon plies the steel that questions the distempered part. Beneath the bleeding hands we feel the sharp compassion of the healer's art. So he's talking about something absolutely savage, but by using a child's rhythm. So in this case, you could say it's deliberately insensitive. But the thing I wanted to point out is that at the heart of that complicated use of rhythm, the yellow fog that rubs its back upon the window panes, is this very, very simple idea of rhythm. The wounded surgeon plies the steel that questions the distempered part. In the middle of 4 quartets, he brings them together and uses something which is close to doggerel, but isn't quite. Also, this is tetrameters, a description of what might be a bomber coming down from the air or the Holy Spirit, who knows. The dove descending breaks the air with flame of incandescent terror, of which the tongues declare the one discharge from sin and error. So that's a sidebar, if you like, about the idea that Often, if you're looking how to make things work, you want to go to very, very simple things. As a general rule, if you can communicate it in a way to a child, then it works. If you can't communicate it to a child, it's not working. I think it's one of the things which is fantastic about poetry, is that poetry in general will find the clearest and simplest way to communicate an idea. Let's look at a couple of other elements. A vital element in music and poetry, as being the same thing, is repetition. Saying the same thing again in different ways. So in the piece of music I played, you might have noticed there's this gesture, which halfway through the piece comes out as a... That little trope, that little figure, ba 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 bum, is the thing which we hold on to it, find our way through. We can have things which work in a, if you like, structurally in a big way. So that figure comes, if I play the piece as I just did, 3 times in the piece. So we recognize it when it comes and we hold on to it. We might call it a refrain, we might call it a chorus. But it also teaches us to point out for small diversions within the poem. I've given you a poem by a writer I really admire, Virginia Graham. She died in 1993. And this, I thought, would be useful because it's also, I think it's worth bringing in here, that poetry, like writing, should be something which we identify with. This was written in 1945 when the lights were turned on in London for the first time after the blackout. And I've been thinking about this as we start to walk around the cities again and we see, boarded shops not going to be boarded up anymore. It's an amazing description, basically, of standing on the top of the Edgware Road at the moment that the lights are turned on after the end of the war. Think about this idea of repetition, big and small, which I just mentioned. This is pentameter. It's in 5 feet per line. They who had seen such beautiful things in their time, the treasures of continents liberally laid before them, spring in the south of France, Florence in June, the glories of Greece, the secrets of Egypt's tombs. Kings in their coaches riding in proud processions, yachts floating white in rich blue tropic seas, peacocks on summer lawns by rose-pink castles, court balls, cathedrals, Paris in Samarkand. They who had seen such beautiful things in their time, whose eyes had been ever blessed by loveliness, stood still, amazed, at the top of the Edgware Road, and looked at the tiny, trembling, newborn lights, casting their pitiful glow on the greasy streets, casting their small pale pools on the furtive curb. Stood still, in silence, speechless with adoration. And their eyes, betrayed, were suddenly filled with tears, not having seen such beautiful things for a long time. First of all, the simple thing is the lines 1, 2, 3, 4. Well, you can see the middle of the poem, the one I put an indent halfway down so you can see it. They who had seen such beautiful things in their time is repeated almost 3 times, because you go to so we have one A, B, A repeated twice, 8 lines down, and then you go to the very last line of the poem, not having seen such beautiful things for a long time. And that's a very kind of simple modifying device I think we all recognize from writing. You set something up, you set an expectation up, and you slightly change it. If you go right back to the earliest writing in practically every single culture, doesn't matter where you go, some of the earliest writing we have is something which Umberto Eco wrote a great deal about, which is making lists. If you think about it, in most religious texts, most mythical texts, making lists is incredibly important. And she uses this. In fact, if you notice in the previous poem, Rossetti does it as well. A list, rainbow shells, purple seas, apple trees, basically making a list. Because one of the things which is beautiful is if you make a list of things, then those images fill the mind. But I just want you to have a quick look at what's going on when Graham makes her list. So we have, literally, she effectively says, I'm going to give you a collection. Seen such beautiful things in their time, the treasures of continents liberally laid before them. So there's spring in France, Florence in June. She Look what's happening in the list. Look at the little devices being used, which writing devices. So the first obvious one is alliteration. And alliteration is often used like this. So spring in the south of France. So SS. And then S turns to F. Anybody who knows anything about older English will know that she's probably having a joke there, because S and F were written the same way until the 18th century. So spring in the south of France. So SSFF, the glories of Greece. Then she uses secrets, which takes us back to the previous line. So there's a little bit of a circular structure there going on. What's fantastic about the way that people listen, and actually it's the way that birds sing as well, is constantly you'll hear memory being used and played with. So she takes you far enough away from the S sound, gets you past the glories of Greece, and then hits you with an S sound again, the secrets of Egypt's tombs. Effectively, she's saying, pay attention to the grain of this. If you listen to a wren singing very early in the morning, you'll hear exactly the same thing going on. A wren will do a thing where they have three or four parts to their song, which is about 13 seconds long, which will go something like beep, 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 and then it will do that twice, beep, 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 and then the second time it might go beep, beep, and then so you see the buzzing thing moves around the line. It will vary, but using memory for the singer, but also it's the way it's communicating. If you listen carefully, it will always be talking to another one about 200 meters away, which will be doing something similar. These are very basic things. It's also linked to the idea of the relationship between rhythm and rhyme. So the very first poem I gave you, the Rossetti, uses a deliberately easy set of rhymes. Basically, shoot, fruit, see, me, dies, eyes, and then plays a little game. Can you go back to the Rossetti and have a look at the last 5 lines? This is where the brain's being used in a way where there's an interesting relationship between reading aloud and reading on the page, because no English speaker of any age is not going to get themselves into trouble when you go from eyes through to fleur de lis, I'm not going to say the end of it, and me, because fleur de lis, according to the rhyme scheme, rhymes with me, but also has been made so it might rhyme with eyes, because there's no correct way of pronouncing fleur de lis or fleur de lis. So there's the kind of game is being played with us and is being played with you as to how we listen and how we read. Again, it's all to do with attention. So let's go back to the Virginia Graham and back to the repetition. If you look for 5 lines up from the bottom, then you get this very, very simple form of repetition. The most simple thing, which is to repeat almost a whole line, one line after the other. So we have this amazing moment of the people standing on a rainy, boring London street being amazed at the lights being turned on, casting their pitiful glow on the greasy streets, casting their small pale pools on the furtive curb. So effectively, very, very small scale attention being paid to the way that alliterative letters are being repeated on a small scale. The very big scale of they who had seen such beautiful things in their time, and then a kind of medium scale, a rhetorical device of just repetition, casting their pitiful glow, casting their small pale pools. And then I wanted to move back to the 17th century. This is a poet who is absolutely contemporaneous with the music that I played to begin with, the late 1600s. This is Aphra Behn, who is one of our greatest writers, and she's one of the first people who can claim to maybe have come close to inventing the novel. She's buried in Westminster Abbey, but she didn't make it. As a woman, she wasn't allowed into the Abbey. She's buried just outside the door, outside Poets' Corner. So you come out of the door into the cloisters at Poets' Corner, and there's her grave just there. I want to read this, coming back to paying attention to the feet, but also some of the things I've just been talking about. So particularly emphasis on repeated consonants, for instance, repetition, and rhyme. This time you'll find that the feet change the whole time. So it means the things to look out for, it's not a test, but it's worth seeing, is the various simple types of foot. One is da, an iamb. Another will be da, which is a trochee. Another which is a spondy, da. Next one, an anapest, which is the rhythm it sounds like, da, anapest. And the other one, a dactyl, the finger rhythm, da, da. That's sometimes called a Molossian rhythm for some reason. I won't overemphasize them, but those are all of the feet that Aphra Behn uses. Love in fantastic triumph sat, whilst bleeding hearts around him flowed. For whom fresh pains he did create, and strange tyrannic power he showed. From thy bright eyes he took his fire, which round about in sport he hurled, but 'twas from mine he took desire enough to undo the amorous world. From me he took his sighs and tears, from thee his pride and cruelty, from me his languishments and fears, and every killing dart from thee. Thus thou and I the god have armed, and set him up a deity. But my poor heart alone is harmed, whilst thine the victor is, and free. Now, it's going to sound really obvious to point out, but what might be a bit of a surprise is there are only 2 sentences there. So we find our way through 2 sentences. The first sentence ends with the word world, and the other sentence ends with the word free. I want to just think a little bit about contradiction, which is if you are breaking things up using rhythm and rhyme like this, how do you then flow through it? Anybody who grew up spending a huge amount of time in church, as I did, will know how excited choir masters will get about whether or not, even if you're singing a very simple rhythm and a simple hymn structure, whether or not the syntax and the grammar is meant to flow from one line to another. And, it's different from country to country. In England, we tend to make a great deal of it, whereas in Nordic countries, they have a tendency not to do this. So just look at this. If I try and now read it without paying attention to the rhythm. Love in fantastic triumph sat while bleeding hearts around him flowed, for whom fresh pains he did create and strange tyrannic power he showed. It's almost impossible to do it. The exciting thing about this is that the structure is set up in a way, it's like an armature, which means you can be as free as you like, and the listener is being taken through it. So I could completely stop. Love in fantastic triumph sat, whilst bleeding hearts around him flowed, for whom fresh pains he did create, and strange tyrannic power he showed. It gives you freedom to play with speed. And one thing is interesting, for most of you will be writing for other people to read. Thinking about this gives you control, whether you're writing prose or poetry, as to how people give voice to your writing. So if you think about even a writer who uses unbelievably long sentences. In French, for instance, the obvious example would be Proust, where it's quite common in Proust, in say, À côté de chez soi, to find a sentence which is 300 words long. But because he's constantly playing with these ideas of how the thing snakes around, using the rhythm, playing with alliteration, assonance, which I haven't talked about, you're being helped through, even if you don't understand it, by this set of rules which helps you to listen, which is absolutely a musical thing, because I think this is the thing I want to kind of circle back round to almost to finish with, which is this, and then maybe if there are any questions we could just play with those. I'm not much of a fan of opera, but there's something I have learned from opera, which is this. Every so often people will do a survey of how many of the words people hear when they go to opera in their own language and how many of the words people hear when they go to hear opera in a language which is not theirs. The really interesting thing is there's not that much difference. So when an English person goes to hear opera in English, they usually recognize between 3 and 5 of the words. When an English person goes to hear an opera in Italian, even if they're not an Italian speaker, they usually recognize between about 2 and 4 of the words. So something else is going on. And I think it's what goes on the whole time when we use language. And of course, all of you are going to be very worried naturally about making yourselves clear. But I think it's exciting to remember that at the basis of this is all of these techniques which, if you like, take advantage of the fact we sometimes won't be able to make ourselves clear, and it almost doesn't matter. For instance, I suspect that most of you in that Rossetti poem don't know what the word via means, V-A-I-R. I mean, there's no shame in that. She's used that word, to be honest, because it fits really, really well. What it actually means is a decoration made from the alternating black and white tails of a certain kind of squirrel. I mean, you really don't need to know that. She's put it there because it sounds nice. It has no function whatsoever. In fact, it's a bit of a problem when you know what it means, because all you're thinking about is all these squirrels' tails. It doesn't help. It's just, I'm going to use the word, it's just music. Someone once said about the English don't like music, but they really like the sound it makes. That's actually quite useful when it comes to writing as well, because there is a tendency, and I think I'm going to leave you this before I hand you back to Melina, for people to write silently. And I would ask you all as a question for yourselves, how much do you speak or even sing or poeticize your writing when you're writing it? If all you're doing is writing and there's nothing coming out, it simply won't work. Because if it can't be heard, if it can't be sounded, then somebody else won't understand it when they read it. In fact, I basically just defined most academic writing, of course, which, if you read it out aloud, would be, I work on the edge of musicology. And musicology is the worst academic writing in all academic writing. Literally, it's writing which should be burned, useful to start fires with. But you don't want to do that. And I think the fact that music and poetry and writing have an absolutely common source is a good place to begin.